In this module, we're going to tackle the very wide-ranging, large topic of gender and sexual development. There's a lot of different ways that we can go with this particular topic, but what we're going to be doing in this lecture portion of the module is focusing our attention on a lot of the research-based ideas of how we can connect lifespan development to, in particular, gender and also sexual activity. That's going to lead way to the textbook talking about some biological changes relating to gender and sexuality that happen and some topics that we don't get a chance to quite go into in this particular lecture on those areas. And then after you've seen those two things, or I guess read and seen this video, you're going to have a chance to look at something that's not really addressed in the literature nor in this video, but is a critical topic that I want you to have some kind of familiarity with. And it's the kind of gray zones when it comes to gender and sexuality that many researchers have overlooked over the years. So what you're going to do in the second part of this module, instead of watching me talk again, is watch a video called Middle Sexes, and it's an HBO documentary from actually a number of years ago now that's still relevant today and covers a lot of topics that I think tend to, again, be overlooked by researchers looking at this area and to need to be addressed for a lot of individuals. So I encourage you to, even though that video is much longer than our typical lectures, to watch it through in its entirety, and hopefully you'll get a lot out of that. But let's get started with the material in this lecture right now. Introduce you to some of the research that's been done with respect to gender. I thought we'd start this lecture out by doing a slightly uncomfortable task. This task is going to ask you to just take words or concepts and sort them as being linked to boys or girls. Now, I completely appreciate that we don't necessarily have to assume that only boys fit into specific groups or only girls fit into specific groups, or that even we should be talking about this dichotomy of people either being boys or girls. We're going to get to that stuff. But what I want us to do, just to understand what researchers look at when it comes to kind of our development of ideas on gender and things that we can actually use to define nuances to gender, is just do this sorting task. And this shouldn't take long. All you have to do is go through each word and link it up with, again, being tied to boys or girls. And after you're done with that, let's move on to the next slide. Now, my guess is that most of you were able to sort things without lots of stops. You might have had a couple things that maybe through personal experiences sort of tripped you up, or you might have recognized led you to identify with a different gender or sex than most individuals. But my guess is that most of you probably sorted things through that list in the exact same way, even if you did it with a lot of discomfort while you were going through it. And the ability to do this speaks to a very powerful concept that's persistent within our society and across many different societies. It's this idea of something called gender. Now, typically, people tend to think of gender and biological sex as the exact same thing. It's not quite 100% true. Biological sex deals with the chromosome combinations that we possess within our cells that are usually either XX or XY. There's a limited few individuals that might have chromosome pairs of XXX or XYY or XXY, but the vast majority of the population does have the chromosome pairs of XX, which is linked to females, and XY, which is linked to males. Biological sex, though, is not quite the same as gender. Gender is usually kind of the conceptual idea of sex, I guess, and it's usually been focused in our history on linking things up to either male or female genders. And when we talk about individuals and their perspectives on gender, there's a lot of kind of nuances within that concept of gender that pop up. The gender we identify as, either male, female, or in today's society, non-binary, third, or kind of a variety of different types of gender identities that people are kind of affiliated with these days. These gender identities that people take on are kind of a subcategory of the topic of gender. And it's also expanded our definition of gender, since we no longer just assume that everybody has to neatly fit into one of two categories. This idea also can be applied to these ideas of what we call gender roles and gender typing. Gender roles historically have been either male or female, and they've related to kind of the cognitive tendencies, behavioral tendencies, emotional expectations that we place on members that have identified with a specific gender. Gender typing is usually things or ideas that are associated with those genders. So for example, caring might be a concept that links up with females, and that relates to what we would call a gender role. If we're looking at gender typing, we could say pink tends to be tied to girls or females, which is kind of odd that I use that example because that's a relatively new thing that we've paired up with females. Historically, pink actually tended to be tied to males in numerous cultures, but over the last, I think it was 100 plus years, pink has now been tied to males and now, boys. Pink has been tied to females and blue has been tied to boys. And that's led to people trying to find ways, because of our kind of obsessions with gender typing, to associate specific people who have been tied to specific genders to colors. It really shows how persistent and kind of dominant our ideas of gender can actually be. But this gets us to that activity now that we were talking about before. Most of you were probably able to sort things along those binary gender lines that we talked about earlier. And I'm guessing that many of you, when you were trying to do this, had lots of disputes about whether or not we should be doing this, or whether or not that even if you could do this, those things were actually right. Many people in gender research, especially ones that tie developmental psychology to gender research, understand and appreciate those discomforts. And what they try to do is get a better sense as to kind of why they are so persistent, and also when these things pop up. And that's what a lot of what we're going to be talking about in this first half of this lecture is going to focus on. And the development of those things that become almost automatic in our heads by the time we become adults. So let's start in exploring this by going to the beginning. What we tend to see is that very early on in life, most children tend to already start to be attuned to gender and start to kind of conform to gender lines at very early ages. Most researchers suggest that but by the age of 2, almost every child can identify their gender and start to understand some of the behaviors and some of the items that are associated with the gender that they identify with. And this, of course, leads to the very uncomfortable, inevitable question of why? Why is this the case? Why are so many young children already especially attuned to gender, even though it's not a very important component to their life at that very young age? Well, to understand this, we have to look at the way that individuals are treated right. Shown that pretty much at the moment of birth, parents, family members, peers, neighbors all start to treat individuals differently based on the gender that the child has been assigned. If you look at the treatment of females, you usually see many parents, many adult figures using words like sweet and innocent, and being a little bit more cautious and kind of nurturing of these females, even before they're able to even understand what the concept of gender actually is. For boys, many comments like they're tough or they're going to be a professional blank player kind of pops up even within the first few days after birth. And this treatment can be intentional at times, but many researchers have argued that it's almost sometimes implicit and unintentional. But nonetheless, it's a very powerful effect. In fact, there was a very famous study done a number of years back called the Little Baby X study, where individuals were brought into a lab and allowed to play, or actually asked to watch, a young child that was labeled as either a boy or a girl based on the name that the child was assigned. And what the researchers were interested in doing is seeing how these adults who had never seen this baby before would interact with the child once it had been assigned a specific gender. And what they found was that even though the differential behavior wasn't overly dramatic, there were quantifiable differences in the ways people treated the baby based on whether or not it was labeled as a boy or a girl. And the belief is that after many, many encounters like this for a number of years, many children start to internalize this and they start to, even if they don't quite understand the concepts of gender, start to kind of move toward a specific gender identification, and within doing that, move towards a lot of the gender roles and the gender kind of norms or types that we typically link with that gender. This is also enhanced in specific cultures. Some cultures, some groups are a little bit more open to gender crossing over and to not necessarily focusing a lot on gender typing with children. Other societies put a lot of emphasis on gender and will even separate young infants out based on the gender that they are. And this can really enhance some of the effects that are seen across a wide variety of cultures. This is also something that could be enhanced even more through the parental kind of tendencies of adults, where males are often paired with boys in terms of childcare duties, and females tend to be paired with girls. And that leads to lots of modeling and other things that can really enhance some of the tendencies that might have already emerged due to some of the socialization effects that pop up. We're looking back at some cognitive ideas that might explain how these effects work. This concept of schemas is a very likely candidate as to why lots of girls and lots of boys by the age of 2 already have a lot of the mindsets and kind of filters that they use to see the world that adults have when it comes to gender and kind of what's appropriate across a wide range of different situations. Looking for potential other sources of some of the gender differences that we see, we can look to something that actually pops up a little bit later in our development, in particular during that wonderful period of puberty that we talked about in some previous lectures. There's a very clear distinction between most males and females in terms of their production of these chemicals that we talked about earlier called hormones. Both males and females do produce massive amounts of additional hormones once puberty starts, which is linked to the development of both our primary and secondary sex characteristics. But females produce much, much more of the hormone called estrogen by the time they've gone through puberty. And males produce much more testosterone by the time they go through puberty. And this is obviously linked to the development of a lot of those primary and secondary sex characteristics that we talked about earlier. It's also probably important to note that these hormones have been tied to gender-linked identities, roles, and typing. There's been numerous studies that have linked higher levels of testosterone production to aggressive tendencies. This is true for males who are extremely aggressive, and there's also been some studies that have examined how when females are taking massive amounts of testosterone for a multitude of different purposes, their rates of aggressiveness tend to tick up. Now, we know many of you might be able to think of individuals who were taking testosterone that didn't see those upticks in aggression. It's not a guarantee, and this is where we get into the wonderful world of psychology where we can talk about effects, but there's always exceptions to the norm. But if we look at it as a whole, what we tend to see is that more testosterone does link up with more masculine linked ideas and kind of roles that sometimes pop up. There's also, if we're looking at kind of the changes that happen when it comes to the differences between boys and girls, numerous studies that have shown that when puberty hits, that this kind of gender intensification does really manifest itself in a lot of the behaviors that kids display. Essentially, in some cultures, there are many kids that can buck the constraints of gender identities and a lot of the rules and typing that get supplied to those gender identities. But most children, when they undergo puberty, either because of the hormones or because of the way they look differently, do tend to kind of migrate towards the behaviors and the kind of approaches that they're usually tied to based on their gender. We're looking for other indicators that hormones are important. There's actually been some studies that have looked at individuals whose hormone levels or reactions to hormone levels differ from the majority of the population. And those have also given us kind of an understanding of how critical hormones might be in some of the gender things that we see. There are males who are what we call androgen insensitive, where they possess the XY chromosome pair, but because their bodies are not receptive to androgens or what we often call testosterone, essentially they don't develop a lot of the primary sex characteristics of males, and they don't go through puberty the same way that males go through it. And if we're looking at their behaviors and sometimes even their identities, they tend to be linked to females. For the other individuals, there's this thing called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, where essentially there's kind of a high reaction to the adrenal gland where hormones aren't produced correctly. And this can actually happen for both males and females. And what we see is kind of a more chaotic, unusual gender pairing that pops up for individuals that again speaks to the potential that even if our environment is the primary player to a lot of the development of the gender identities, roles, and typing that we've been talking about, there might be some biological components to this as well. And kind of overlooking them wouldn't be giving us the complete story. If we're looking a little bit more closely at how we develop throughout the lifespan, as I mentioned, usually by about the age of 2, when we're getting into early childhood, most children can already identify with a specific gender and can easily identify roles and a lot of the typing that we were looking at earlier when we did that first activity. It might seem odd, but a 3-year-old could probably do what you did in the beginning of that activity just as easily as you could, in fact, probably more easily, because they wouldn't be as concerned about whether or not they were being politically correct or kind of addressing all of the considerations when it came to how we might sort individuals into kind of, or ideas into one group or another. This is also seemingly very true for males at this age. There's been numerous studies that have suggested that not only are males more hypervigilant to the gender differences at young ages, but there seems to be societal kind of impacts that might explain this. Numerous cultures, unfortunately, do punish males significantly more than females for not conforming to the gender that they're assigned. And this is something that might perpetuate some of the gender issues that we often see in these cultures. But it is something that is kind of note if we're looking for why males in particular seem to kind of rush into a lot of those gender typing things that we see in childhood. As we get into adolescence and puberty hits, as we mentioned earlier, this gender intensification process does happen, and we believe this is that moment when both biology and society come together and really push individuals during puberty to kind of intensify their gender linking or kind of their gender identification. Oddly enough, as we get into adulthood and beyond, even though people become much more steadfast in their gender identity, the behaviors that they display, the things that they link up with themselves, tend to become less conformist and tend to actually go into what we sometimes call the androgynous area. This is especially true for males who tend to see the kind of increase in kind of more female related behaviors and female related typing. But it's not necessarily true for all males. It's also important to note here that even though females don't see a dramatic shift, like it said in this slide here, some studies have suggested that there is a gradual shift towards slightly more masculine behavior in older age. It's just something that's very tough to capture with a lot of the social research that we've been doing historically. When we talk about differences, though, especially when it comes to typing, I want us to appreciate that a lot of these differences that we see tend to be significantly overblown. Many of us probably have heard lots of rumors about how one gender has better visual spatial skills, or better math skills, or better language skills, or better empathy skills, or whatever it is. But understand that a lot of these differences that we find in research are there, but they're minute. Essentially, what we look at with males and females, when we look at all whole wide range of different skills that are different amongst the genders, are two normal curves that are almost perfectly overlapped. It's just that subtle pull of the normal curve in one direction versus another leads to differences between the genders that we can find through tests, and leads to people kind of having this perception that essentially all males are on one side and all females are on another side, and there's no overlaps between those groups. There's definitely examples to the situation that are a little bit more robust than what we see here in this slide. But for the vast majority of things that we tend to link to gender, the differences are highlighted just like we see here in this slide, or the caption on the left. It is important to note that a lot of these things, though, are, we think, socially contrived. One of my favorite examples of this relates to reading and math skills. Numerous studies have, over the years, examined the challenges that females go through in childhood when trying to develop basic reading and math skills. In the 1940s, 1950s, there was an obsession with trying to figure out if women just couldn't inherently learn these skills when they were entering elementary school. Oddly enough, in our current generation, researchers are now looking really hard at males in terms of their reading and math skills and trying desperately to figure out if there's a reason behind why males can't learn math at these young ages and can't learn their reading and writing skills, at least as well as females. It goes to show that specific types of treatments, specific types of environment, assumptions of teachers, all are probably playing a much bigger role in any of the gender differences that we see than anything that's biologically inherent. And most importantly, even if those differences are emerging, they're minimal, and we tend to blow them out of proportion dramatically. So when we're talking about gender differences, what I want us to really focus on is of how people sort themselves out into gender and how they start to see themselves, treat themselves differently based on the gender they identify with. That's what a lot of the work that many researchers today has focused. If we're looking at kind of one topic that's become especially interesting, but also a little sensitive, it relates to how gender might differ on a topic that's kind of intertwined with it, sexual activity. And what we see in numerous studies is, much like we talked about before, even though there's been an assumption that there is a dramatic difference between the genders when it comes to sexual activity, when we actually run studies, the effects are minimal at best. Numerous studies have shown that the sexual frequency, the desire for sexual activity, and things linked to sexual activity that aren't with a partner, like masturbation, are very similar across the genders. Even though there is this perception that females tend to want to have sex less, tend to masturbate less, tends to engage in any type of sexual activity or want to engage in any type of sexual activity less, statistically in numerous interviews and studies, when people are given a chance to kind of provide responses without any judgment passed on them, what we see is that the differences between men and women is minimal at best. This also relates to homosexual activity, something that's been taboo for years. As researchers have been able to look at this much more closely, what they found is a lot of our assumptions about gender lines are just incorrect. What we see is that around 5% of the women in the United States identify as LBG, at least according to a poll taken in 2007 or 17, sorry, by Gallup. And around 1.3% of them have engaged in sexual activity within the past year. For males, slightly fewer of them have identified as homosexual, and a slightly larger amount have engaged in sexual activity over the last year. But I want us to understand, in the grand scheme of things, these number differences are minimal at best. And so essentially what we consistently see in numerous studies is that all of the assumptions that we have when it comes to sexual activity and gender tend to be overblown. And if we're looking at why this is probably the case, there's a constant schema that kind of underlies many cultures called sexual scripts. This kind of idea of what females should do in sexual activities and what males should do in sexual activities and how both groups should approach these things, that seems to have a slight pull on both genders to cause some of the subtle differences that we see, but also has even greater pull on our perceptions of sexual activity and gender. And in the kind of end product, what we see is this, well, small difference between men and women that we really overblow based on our own interpretations. This idea of sexual activity to development, we probably have to start somewhere that is a little uncomfortable. It's with the work of a very controversial figure in the history of psychology that you've probably heard of in multiple classes, named Sigmund Freud. Freud is somebody who, over the years, developed a number of outlandish ideas of kind of what makes us tick, but he also is somebody that introduced us to kind of exploring a wide range of different topics. He was one of the individuals that kind of reinvented clinical psychology and reinvented personality psychology, and essentially allowed people to start talking about topics like sex in the scientific world in a way that we had never been able to do before. That being said, a lot of the things he talked about were kind of nonsensical. This was especially true when he tried to dabble in this idea of what he called sexuality development. And this idea was actually something that Freud proposed near the latter stages of his career, when he was trying to explain where a lot of the stressors that he discussed in his numerous studies were actually coming from. Freud was a huge advocate for arguing that lots of our issues, either sexual or mental, were a byproduct of problems that occurred during our childhood. And to explain how sex played a major role in this, he introduced some kind of unusual ideas that are persistent to this day. One of the ideas he talked about was this concept of what he called libido, or psychosexual energy. He argued that all of us, pretty much at the moment of birth, are psychosexual individuals. We're looking for some type of gratification that kind of manifests itself in sexuality. But his argument was is that this libido were linked up with these things that he called erogenous zones, different areas of the body that when stimulated could provide some type of sexual pleasure. It's just that these erogenous zones moved around based on the age that we were. So he argued that our first erogenous zone when we were born was actually our mouth, where we took lots of pleasure from chewing things and biting things and sucking on things. And if we got enough stimulation from those things, we would be satiated and we essentially wouldn't have a buildup of psychosexual energy at a young age. But if we didn't get to explore the world with our mouth and stick everything in it and taste everything, well, then it would eventually result in this thing that he called an oral fixation, where we need to kind of meet these unmet needs later on in life through smoking or overeating or needing to chew on our pencils or whatever it is. Now, for those of you that were chewing on a pencil as I said this, please understand that, as I mentioned, a lot of this stuff was nonsensical. There's no research to suggest that if you didn't get the bottle enough when you were one, you now need to chew violently on gum every single day, or you have a tendency to overeat. That it's just not something that we've seen in numerous studies that have tried to either kind of show that there's some proof for these ideas or disprove them. It's kind of a consistent thing in most of his work. The next stage he talked about was what was called the anal stage, where our erogenous zone moved to our well, sort of reproductive organs. It moved to our bowels and bladders, where we were able to either control them or not. And if we could control them, we could derive a lot of pleasure from that. If we couldn't, well, then that would manifest itself in another fixation where we became very obsessed with orderliness or kind of making sure that we held on to everything as much as we could throughout our entire life. Uh, this actually is something that you might have heard before that you didn't necessarily trace back to Freud. When you called yourself extremely anal because you needed your notes organized or you needed something clean, you probably didn't think that you were arguing that you weren't potty trained correctly, so now you need this to be taken care of, but that actually came from Freud, and that's sort of what Freud concluded when talking about what might happen if things go wrong at this second psychosexual stage of development. He then talked a lot about what's called the phallic stage and how we start to associate with a specific gender at this point, and we start to have all of these obsessions with members of the opposite gender, in particular, our parent of the opposite sex, he said, was a primary focus for most of us. And his argument was that at this moment in life, we not only start to identify with a gender, but lots of problems based on our gender start to appear. Like for males, we start to develop this thing called castration fear, where we worry that essentially if our father or somebody else found out about our desires for somebody else, we might have that wonderful thing that we've now identified as being male cut off. And for females, there's this development of this thing called penis envy, where there's this realization that essentially you don't have something that another percentage of the population has, and it makes you essentially envious for the rest of your life. Again, don't put too much stock in this stuff. Please don't believe that all females are envious of males for the rest of their life once they reach around 3 or 4 because they realize they don't have a penis. It's not even something that most of Freud's followers were in agreement with. In fact, his daughter, Anna Freud, and another female that researcher that worked with him named Karen Horney, one of the first things they did when Freud stepped down from the Psychodynamic Institute was revisit this phallic stage and argue that maybe what we were looking at this stage was not penis envy that was the biggest problem, but womb envy, where males start to worry that they're not going to be able to bear children, so they have to try to prove themselves, and in doing so, try to put down women as much as possible. It's, again, not also something that's been proven to be true through research, but it kind of highlights how a lot of these ideas were more just for social consumption and ideas than something that was based in a lot of research. But if we want to kind of look at the grand scheme of this, understand that this idea of sexual development and how sex emerged was a really persistent idea for a number of decades. And in fact, most people who wanted to study how we develop sexually tended to just build off of Freud's work for an extended period of time. And what it's led us to is a current era where we've only had a few years, a couple decades actually now at this point, to try to study this concept of sexual development in any logical scientific way. As a result of that, we still have an incomplete picture when it comes to how we develop sexually in comparison to a lot of the other areas of development that we've explored before. Looking at some science that's focused on this idea of how we develop sexually, there are some studies that have looked at both childhood and adolescence and kind of the early inklings of sexual development that pops up. It's probably important to note that it's difficult to study sexual activity and sexual interests in children because it's a very sensitive and taboo topic, but researchers that have been able to garner some sort of research and some sort of results from this topic of sexual development in children tend to see that the first inklings of sexuality in children revolve around what's called sex play and also just basic exploration of biological differences between the genders. And even though interests in sex is fairly minimal for most kids, there are some individuals, even at this young age, that start to display a kind of extra attention to sexuality and an extra interest in differences between the genders. But for most kids, the first kind of experience of something that would even be remotely considered sexual does happen in early to middle childhood when there's no real interest in sexual engagement as much as just exploring the differences between the genders that these kids are now acutely aware of. Obviously, as we transition from childhood into adolescence, especially as puberty hits, this focus goes away from just kind of curiosity and into a lot of the sexual focuses that we tend to think of in adulthood. This is where sex play and sex exploration takes on a new connotation, where children start to, sorry, not children, adolescents start to engage in activities that aren't usually typically what we would think of as sex, but of exploring, stimulating sexual organs and exploring kind of the kind of idea, the sexual organs of others to get a better sense of this thing that most adults tend to not like to talk about around children or adolescents. What we also see here is that this speeding up of sexual activity in adolescence is something that's very closely tied to different cultures. In fact, we're going to talk about that on the next slide significantly more. It's also important to note here that during adolescence, we do start to see the emergence of homosexuality or bisexuality, and these emergences tend to lead to adulthood differences, but it's really important to note that this is considered a very fluid situation at this point. So some individuals who engage in homosexual behavior in early adolescence might not engage in say, homosexual behavior in adulthood, and this is also true in the opposite way. It's essentially the first point where we see this start to emerge, but it's definitely not an end point, which is what I want to really stress here. It's also really interesting to note when we look at adolescence that a lot of the gender differences that we've discussed earlier when it comes to gender and sex seem to be really enhanced at this moment in development. Males tend to, in surveys, report being much more interested in sex. They tend to report being much more interested in the kind of biological components of sex, and their conversations tend to revolve much more around sex and sexual encounters than what we see with their female counterparts. It's not true for everybody, but statistically, when we're looking at those curves that we talked about earlier, the two normal curves, The male normal curve is, if we're talking about comparisons, compared to most differences between the genders, significantly more spread out, or I guess further away than the female normal curve than it is when we get into adulthood and beyond. Now, as we get into adulthood, as I mentioned, the differences between men and women starts to get a little bit smaller, and it also involves kind of a shifting in sexual activity to an extent for everybody. We do see once we get into early adulthood that most individuals do have more sexual partners than they had when they were adolescents. They engage in sex more often than they did when they were in adolescence. But it's also important to note that we see a wide range of differences from person to person, not necessarily gender to gender, but person to person when it comes to how many sexual partners people have and how often they're engaging in sexual activity. This kind of wide range of kind of differences and ebbing of flowing of sexual activity is persistent for a large portion of most individuals' lives. It's not until usually mid-40s for females and sometimes 50s and 60s for males that we start to see a slight downtip in sexual interest and sexual activity in both females and males. The thing that's often tied to the drop in sexual interest in females is this change that we talked about earlier called menopause, the moment when females stop having the ability to kind of reproduce because of the kind of the lack of production of eggs. Menopause obviously involves more than just the lack of production of eggs. It also involves the change of a lot of different hormones, and these hormones have been tied also to the decreased interest and decreased frequency of sexual activity. For males, it's not as robust of an effect, but you do see a slight downtick in interest in sexual activity when males get into their 40s, but the most marked decrease for males usually happens about a decade or two later. And the assumption is that for both males and females, once the males catch up, there's this continual downward trend in interest in sexual activity and frequency of sexual activity all the way into late adulthood, where theoretically almost nobody should be interested in or engaging in sex. Here's a catch, though. Even though there's lots of reports of these drops to the point where it's almost non-existent, numerous studies have actually shown through kind of ulterior information that this decline in sexual interest and sexual activity might not be quite as robust as we had originally thought. One of the areas that's really highlighted how many adults, even in their 70s, 80s, and beyonds, are still sexually active is research that's shown that the kind of spread, the transmission of sexually transmitted diseases is extremely high in lots of nursing homes, lots of elderly homes, where individuals we now know are engaging in much more sex than they tend to report themselves engaging in. And this really highlights how, if we're going to study this topic, one of the big challenges is that we have to overcome a lot of the taboos tied to sex and development. Otherwise, what we're going to get is kind of incomplete information that makes it really challenging to tackle this idea in a scientific way. But nonetheless, we're going back to this idea of changes in adulthood based on those findings. It's important to note that this has led to questions about how much that decline actually occurs from middle adulthood to late adulthood, and if it's as universal as we had thought, or if there's a greater frequency, a greater range of individuals engaging in different frequencies and kind of partner levels that we saw when we looked at people in early to middle adulthood. Going back to something we talked about earlier, as I mentioned, one of the big things that seems to be a player in the emergence of individual differences once adolescence hits is cultural differences. What we've seen in numerous studies is that many individuals do start to engage in their first sexual activity at around the time of early adolescence, around 13, 14, 15. But what's important to note here is that the sexual activity that's engaged in varies dramatically from child to child. Some adolescents consider sexual activity kissing. Others consider it just kind of holding hands or engaging in just playing with the sexual organs of their partner. There's obviously a wide range of what's defined as sex. I don't need to go over a list of these things, but understand that based on people's backgrounds and the cultures they're coming from, what it means to be sexually active does vary dramatically from group to group. And if we're looking at things that are big precursors to engaging in the actual act of sex, what we see is that there are some characteristics or some predictors within our United States culture that seems to be tied to both boys and girls not only engaging in more sexual activity, but engaging in it at a much younger age. For individuals that are parts of groups that are much more rampant drug users or engage in much more destructive or detrimental behavior, there's a much higher frequency of sexual activity at much younger ages for these individuals. There's also been numerous studies that have tied less parental or peer support to much earlier engagement in sexual activities than other individuals. And there's other things that have been correlated with this particular kind of activity as well, like lower academic performances and low socioeconomic statuses. Most people would not necessarily argue that your grades or your SES are causing you to engage in sexual activity more often, but there's a belief that there's probably underlying factors that correlate with both of these things that can explain some of the differences that we see within our culture. If you go across the United States, outside of the United States and across the United States, and look at other cultures around the world, what we see is that these differences can be even more robust. Each culture essentially has a huge impact on what it means to be sexually active as an adolescent, and how often and kind of how many individuals these people are actually engaging in these sexual activities with. And again, shows us that it's a tough topic to tackle because of how taboo it is and because of how many moving parts there are trying to understand how this topic emerges with us. And just to throw even more complexity into it, what I thought we'd do now, since we've kind of gone through the scientific part of this, is look at something that even the book didn't really address, and that's the gray zones and the complexity of sexuality that go beyond just defining people as male or female and sex as just between a male and female. And this is going to lead us to this really wonderful documentary by HBO from a number of years ago called Middle Sexes. So if you can, just as a reminder, this video is going to be a little bit longer than our typical lectures, but I really want you to see it through its entirety because there's a lot of really interesting topics that are discussed. There's actually some really good facts that are covered in it. And hopefully when you're done, what you can understand is not necessarily everything you need to know about sex and development and gender, but you can just become more aware of all the things that we need to consider when trying to address this idea. But in terms of what we're covering in the lectures, we're going to close up shop here. So I wish you the best. I hope you do get a good chance to watch that video just like you would watch a lecture. And when you're done, I guess I'll see you all in the next module. Take care.